I still remember the day it all began, and even now the memory carries the same sting as if it happened yesterday. Back then, I was only 22, still figuring out life, still carrying that blend of hope and insecurity that comes with being the middle child in a family where everything revolved around appearances. My mother had always been the type of woman who treated life like it was a chessboard. Every move had to be calculated, every person had to be placed in a certain square, and she never hesitated to sacrifice one piece for another if she believed the endgame would benefit her. To her, my sisters and I were pieces she could arrange, pawns she thought she had the right to maneuver as she pleased. And in her mind, Emily, my older sister, was the queen. I, on the other hand, was the shadow standing just outside the spotlight, the girl who was useful only as long as she stayed out of the way. At the time, I was dating Daniel. He wasn't flashy, he didn't have the kind of loud personality that drew crowds, but he had a way of listening that made me feel like I mattered. He was thoughtful in the small ways that count, he remembered how I liked my coffee, he walked me home in the rain even if it meant he got soaked, and he always reached for my hand when we crossed the street, as if instinctively protecting me. For months we had been slowly building something tender, something real. I dared to dream that this man could be the one. I was young, but I believed in the idea of forever, and for a brief moment I felt like I had found mine. But my mother saw him differently. To her, Daniel wasn't mine, he was a possibility, a potential son-in-law who could add polish to her golden child's future. From the moment she met him, her eyes lingered not on how he looked at me, but how well he would look beside Emily. I should have noticed sooner, the way she leaned into their conversations at dinner, the way her voice shifted when she called his name. She never mentioned my relationship directly, but her silence was louder than words. Slowly, she began to weave her plans. It started with invitations. Suddenly, Daniel was invited to every family dinner, every gathering, every holiday brunch, even when I hadn't said a word about bringing him. And during those dinners, Mom always found a way to sit him next to Emily. "It just works out that way," she would say with that sly smile that I once mistook for coincidence. They laughed at the same jokes, they traded stories, and all the while I sat across the table, pushing food around my plate as if I was the outsider. My mother's eyes would flicker over to me, filled with that mix of pity and superiority, as if she already knew the ending she had written for us. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself my mother was strict, but she wouldn't cross that line. But the truth came crashing down one evening in the kitchen. The plates had just been cleared, Emily was upstairs, and Daniel was chatting with my father in the living room. Mom leaned against the counter, her glass of wine in hand, and said it as calmly as if she were discussing the weather. "You know, sweetheart, Daniel and Emily have such natural chemistry. Don't you think they'd make a beautiful couple?" The words hit like a slap. My throat tightened, and my voice came out sharper than I intended. "Mom, he's my boyfriend." She looked at me with those cool, steady eyes that had cut me down so many times before. "You'll find someone else. You're resilient. But Emily needs someone steady. Someone like Daniel." It wasn't just a suggestion. It was a declaration, and in that moment, I understood exactly how little my happiness meant to her. My protests fell on deaf ears. She had already chosen her storyline, and I was nothing more than a character to be written out. The weeks that followed were like living inside a storm I couldn't escape. Mom orchestrated coincidences that placed Daniel and Emily together constantly. She asked Emily to drive him home when he visited, asked Daniel to help Emily with errands, and always made sure I was conveniently absent. Slowly, the gap between Daniel and me began to widen. The calls that once stretched into midnight became shorter, the texts that once carried warmth dwindled to a few cold lines. I told myself he was busy, that I was overthinking again, but deep down I knew. The distance wasn't accidental. It was designed. One evening, Daniel asked to meet me at a quiet cafe we used to love. I knew before he opened his mouth that something was ending. His hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around his coffee mug, his eyes heavy with guilt. "I don't know how to say this," he began softly, "but your mom, she's been hinting, and Emily and maybe we should try." For a moment, the air was knocked out of me. My chest burned, my eyes stung, but I couldn't cry in front of him. Not then. I sat in silence, watching the man I had once believed in unravel everything with a single sentence. The betrayal wasn't just his, it was my sister's, my mother's. The people who were supposed to protect me had conspired to take from me instead. When I confronted Emily later, she didn't even try to deny it. She just shrugged, her tone casual, almost smug. It just happened, she said, as though love was an accident that slipped out of her hands. And behind her, like a shadow applauding her every move, stood my mother. Her arms folded, her lips pressed into that thin smile of triumph. You'll get over it, she said coldly, as if my broken heart were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. That was the day I realized I couldn't stay. If I remained under her roof, under her rules, I would lose myself completely. So I walked away, from Daniel, from Emily, from the poisonous grip of a mother who saw me as expendable. It hurt more than words could describe, but the pain became the fire that pushed me forward. The years that followed weren't easy. I had to stitch myself back together piece by fragile piece. I moved to another city, built a career, surrounded myself with people who valued me not for how I compared to someone else, but for who I was. Slowly, I learned how to trust again. Slowly, I found my smile. And then I met James. He wasn't part of my mother's plans. He wasn't someone she could have chosen for me, and that was what made him perfect. He saw me for me, not for my shadow, not for my sister's reflection. His love was steady, real, unshakable. When he asked me to marry him, I knew I had finally found the forever my mother had once stolen. But destiny, as cruel as it can sometimes be, has a sense of balance. Because the day James walked into my mother's house for the first time as my husband, the carefully constructed world they had built began to crumble before their eyes. And this time, I would be the one watching. The invitation wasn't exactly heartfelt, it never was with my family, but after months of avoiding them, I finally agreed to visit. I told myself I was stronger now, different from the girl who once walked away in tears. This time, I wasn't coming back as the quiet daughter who always bent to my mother's rules. I was coming back as a wife, as a woman who had built her own life far away from their shadows. James squeezed my hand as we approached the door, a small reassurance that grounded me. He knew my story, every detail of it, and he stood by me with a kind of loyalty that still felt like a miracle. The moment the door opened, it was like stepping into a theater where everyone had frozen mid-scene. Emily stood there, her smile faltering the second she saw who was beside me. Behind her, Daniel's face drained of color, and even my mother's carefully practiced composure cracked into something raw and unsettled. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected him. We walked inside, the air so thick with silence it felt like walking underwater. My father greeted us warmly, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, but the others, they just stared. James, calm as ever, slipped an arm around my waist, his presence radiating confidence. Thank you for having us, he said politely, his voice steady, his smile almost too kind. Daniel was the first to find his voice, though it was strained and low. What are you doing here? His eyes flickered with recognition, panic lacing the edges. He knew exactly who James was, and so did I. Years ago, Daniel had worked under him at his firm. I hadn't known it when James and I first met, but eventually the truth came out. Daniel hadn't left that job on his own terms. He'd been dismissed, fired for dishonesty, for cutting corners, for betraying the trust of a man who had given him chances he didn't deserve. And now here we were, standing in my mother's pristine living room, with the past colliding violently into the present. Emily blinked, confusion written across her face. She looked at Daniel, then back at James, trying to piece together the connection. Wait, you two know each other? She asked, her voice tight with unease. Oh, we do, James answered evenly. His eyes didn't leave Daniel's, and for a second the weight of his gaze was enough to make Daniel shrink back. Daniel used to work for me. Let's just say his work ethic left much to be desired. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emily's eyes widened as the implication sank in. My mother's lips pressed into a thin, furious line, her entire posture shifting as though she had lost control of a carefully choreographed play. For years, she had painted Daniel as the perfect choice for Emily, the man worthy of her golden daughter. And now, in a single sentence, that illusion cracked wide open. I watched them all, the people who once told me I'd get over it, the ones who had treated my heartbreak like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel small in that room. I didn't feel like the shadow cast by Emily's shine. I felt powerful, not because I wanted revenge, but because the truth had finally stepped into the light. Daniel's voice shook as he tried to defend himself. That was years ago. Things were different then. People change. But his words sounded hollow, unconvincing, even to Emily. She took a small step away from him, doubt flashing in her eyes. My mother tried to regain control, her voice sharp as she addressed James. That's enough. Whatever happened at work has nothing to do with this family. But James only tightened his hold on me and smiled politely. With respect, Mrs. Turner, it has everything to do with the way your family treated my wife. You thought she wasn't good enough for him, yet here she stands, stronger than ever, and married to a man who values her. The word wife hung in the air like a victory I didn't even have to claim. My mother's face hardened, Emily's cheeks burned red, and Daniel stared at the floor, his jaw clenched. I didn't need to gloat, the truth was loud enough without me saying a word. For the rest of that visit, the tension never eased. My mother forced small talk, Emily avoided my eyes, and Daniel barely spoke at all. James, on the other hand, was gracious, steady, unfazed by the storm. He asked my father about his garden, helped set the table, even offered to pour wine. He wasn't performing, he was simply himself, and that was enough. To show the difference between the man they had chosen for Emily and the man I had chosen for myself. At one point, I caught Emily watching me. There was something in her expression I couldn't quite read, envy, maybe, or regret. Perhaps she was realizing that what she and Daniel had built wasn't as flawless as she liked to believe. Perhaps she was remembering how easily she had brushed me aside, thinking she had won. But sitting there beside James, I didn't feel the sting of those old wounds anymore. I felt something closer to peace. Dinner ended in strained silence, and when James and I stood to leave, the room shifted again. My mother tried to offer her usual parting words of control, something about visiting more often, but her voice lacked its old authority. Emily forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Daniel didn't say a word. As we stepped outside into the cool evening air, James intertwined his fingers with mine. You okay? He asked softly. I took a deep breath, the night air filling my lungs, and nodded. More than okay. Because for the first time in years, I had walked into that house without fear and walked out without pain. I hadn't needed to prove anything, hadn't needed to lash out or seek revenge. The truth had done all the work for me. My mother's schemes, Emily's betrayal, Daniel's weakness, they had all collapsed under the weight of reality. As we walked toward our car, I glanced back at the house one last time. The windows glowed with warm light, but inside was a family grappling with consequences they had never expected. And for once, I wasn't the one left broken. I was the one who had moved on, who had found love that couldn't be manipulated or stolen. James squeezed my hand again, and I smiled. Their shock, their silence, their unraveling, that was enough. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't need them to understand. I had built a life on my own terms, and in the end, that was the sweetest victory of all.